everybody, it's Norm from Tested here, and today I'm going to be reviewing the Skydio R1 drone. I'm excited to call this a drone because we've tested a lot of quadcopters in the past, and I've always hesitated in calling them drones because the way I understand it, quadcopters are RC devices that are manually controlled, and drones are fully autonomous devices that don't need direct control, and that's what this is. In fact, I think it's the first fully autonomous drone that I think that lives up to what it advertises. Now, it's fully autonomous because you don't need direct control. It flies by itself, and in this case, it flies for the purposes of filming a subject that's walking, running, or doing some type of outdoor activity, and it does it really well. It's able to do that using computer vision, the processing of camera images that it has all around it, rather than using something like a LiDAR sensor to scan the environment or a trackable wearable sensor that some autonomous drones have done in the past. So I think there are two ways to think about how this system uses computer vision. First is its obstacle avoidance system and its way to detect the environment and avoid things in the environment, and second, in its way to track subjects. Let's talk about obstacle avoidance first. Now, it's not the first drone or quadcopter even that has obstacle avoidance. DJI has the Phantom 4 and the Mavic Pro that both have sensors in the front of it that prevent it from crashing into walls when you're moving at a relatively safe speed. What's different about the Skydio R1 is that it has sensors all around it. 13 cameras, in fact, that work in unison to create a 3D map of its environment. Now, these 13 cameras actually work in stereo pairs. There's a pair of them here, here, on the bottom, on all of its sides. And when it's working in those pairs, these pair of cameras create a depth map. It's actually kind of how our eyes work to let it know how far objects are away from it. It's the same system that the Phantom would use, same principle at least. But here, it's combining all those depth maps at multiple times a second to then create a virtual model of not only its environment, but also where it is in its environment and anticipating where it's going to be as it's flying through that environment. And it works really well. You can see in our videos that when it's flying outdoors, I was running through a pretty dense area in the park, and it was avoiding trees, it was strafing left and right really elegantly, and even ducking below some really low-hanging branches. Think about that. It has this 3D map of the environment, and it has to predict where it's going to be in that environment as it's flying through it. So Skydio says it actually projects its own flight path several seconds ahead. So if it's flying straight, then it thinks it's going to be maybe 4 seconds ahead. It's going to maybe be in the path of a tree. Then it's going to adjust its flight path and fly around it. Now that works great with a static environment, but this gets much more complicated when there's a moving object in the environment as well, like a person. So for example, if it's an environment where it sees there are two trees, one to the left and one to the right of it, no problem, it'll fly right through it. But if there's a third object, a moving object, like a person walking toward it, it has to know that object is also part of the environment, and it has a varying speed, and it has to avoid that object as well. And in our test, it did that great. We were walking all around it, walking toward it, and it never crashed into us. Now, it wasn't able to avoid things that were smaller or moving much quicker, things like a basketball that we tried throwing at it. That definitely knocked it out of the sky. So we wouldn't anticipate for this to be able to avoid fast-moving objects like a car, for example. Don't put this into moving traffic. Now, its second use of computer vision is for the purposes of filming, and this is subject tracking. And once again, the R1 is not the first quadcopter or drone that has subject tracking or uses computer vision for subject tracking. The Phantom 4 and the Mavic Pro also do that, but this does it particularly well. And it has several tracking modes. There's your standard follow mode where it's moving behind a subject, trying to keep a static distance from it. There's a tripod mode where it stands in the same place in the sky and pans around and tilts up and down to keep a subject in the center of its frame. And then there's also a novel side tracking mode where you can be moving across the side of a hill or along the beach and it's moving tangentially to you keeping you on the center of the frame as well. But my two favorite tracking modes were the orbit mode and the lead mode. In the orbit mode, it's constantly moving around a subject, flying around circles around it as that subject is moving, which means it's also varying its speed when it's behind the subject or in the front of the subject or on the side of it, and it creates for these really, really awesome dynamic shots, whether you're walking, running, or on a bicycle. The lead mode, I think, is the most technically impressive feature of this drone. This is where it can be in front of you as a subject, and it could be at maybe eye height and maybe about 3 meters away, and it's flying backwards. And that's only possible because, one, it knows about the environment behind it and around it, but two, because it's also anticipating your trajectory as you're moving forward. So you don't even have to walk in a straight line. You could be walking in one direction and suddenly turn a corner, and it will swing across and still try to be in front of you. I found that so technically impressive. It was almost like having this camera on a dolly on a track in front of you, or on the back of a truck with a steadying jib in front of you as you're walking. It lets you create these really cool walk and talk type scenarios, although I never really be able to use it in that scenario because you'd hear still the sound of these rotors in any audio recording. But there are some limitations for the R1 when it's tracking subjects. Its max speed is 25 miles per hour, which is more than fast enough to steadily track a subject that's walking or running really quickly. But when one of our tests where we were on mountain bikes going along a hill or pretty fast down a hill, it struggled to keep up with us partially because it was trying to evade trees, but also because the subjects were varying its speed. Now, it does predict where the subject is heading, the direction it's heading, but I don't think it's smart enough to predict when the subject is slowing down or when it's going to speed up. And as a result, if you look in the video, what you get is this kind of rubber banding effect where the Skydio is trying to keep at the same distance from these guys on mountain bikes, but it's getting real close, and then suddenly it's backing away, or suddenly, as it's going faster, it has to elevate higher up in the air, and what you then get is some inconsistent video. On several occasions, we also had the Skydio R1 lose tracking on our subject or switch over to a different subject unexpectedly. In more than one occasion, we had a second person wearing similar colored clothing to our track subject cross the path of the camera, and the R1 would switch its targeting over to that person. And in one instance, I even had it switch tracking from me to a random baby stroller that happened to be rolling past the frame. And that definitely freaked me out because it was so unexpected. So I had to pull out the app and tell it to land, and because it just started flying off in a different direction. There are also scenarios where it doesn't work perfectly because of the lighting conditions. You would expect it not to work well in very low light. In the darkness, you definitely wouldn't want to fly this. But even in conditions where there were a lot of different changing lighting conditions, like the camera would somehow get lost in the blinding glare of the sun or a lens flare, it would then freak out and stop tracking as well. But when the R1 works as intended, the kind of tracking that you can get and the type of footage you can get is a whole fresh take on drone cinematography. We're really familiar with the standard types of film you can get with a quadcopter. You know, those landscape shots where the quadcopter is flying really slow over the horizon or rising up next to a building, or those drone-y shots where someone sends a quadcopter off into the distance looking at a single person or a crowd. Those are all pretty standard with things like the Phantom 4 or the Inspire 1 or even the Mavic Pro. But it takes a lot more skill to be able to track a moving subject and film dynamically around it. That's the kind of filming that the Skydio does, well, effortlessly. Whether we're standing on top of a hill after a hike, we could get these really cool, heroic orbit shots, or you're playing sports, whether it's outdoor basketball or even indoor basketball in a gymnasium, you're going to get footage that you could really never get unless you're using really expensive motion-controlled jib equipment. But the footage did leave me wanting more. The video quality on this is, I think, comparable to a high-end GoPro. But not much better than that. And even unlike a GoPro you can buy today, you can't shoot this in any type of log or raw quality setting where you can do post-production color grading. Also, the dynamic range of this is pretty low. In scenarios where you have lots of shadowy areas and very bright areas, those highlights or those shadows are going to get lost. You're not going to be able to pull those details out. There are also no manual setting controls, like no exposure control or shutter speed control on these, which I really would have liked. All you can do is change your frame rate. You can shoot in 4K at 30 frames per second or 1080p at 60 frames per second, but I think there's a real missed opportunity here to be able to shoot at higher than that, 120 frames per second, even at 720p. When you have the subject moving quickly and you have the quadcopter moving quickly, that's a huge opportunity to slow things down and really see that type of action in slow motion and pick out those details. You're also locked into a pretty wide field of view, wider than you'd get on a GoPro. And I think that's because it needs that wide field of view to do its subject tracking, keeping you locked in the center of the frame. And being locked into the center of the frame is another limitation of this. There's no option to tell the camera to position a track subject to the right of the frame or the left of the frame to create more dynamic shots. You get pretty locked in shots where everything's gonna look similar, your subject's gonna be right in the center, and maybe you have to crop in post-production. There's 64 gigs of onboard storage, which you can access using an included USB-C cable, but there's no expandable storage or micro SD storage option, which I find a little disappointing, not because I need more than 64 gigs, I think that's plenty, you can get about an hour and a half of 4K video, but because I want to be able to pull that footage off easily. And right now you have to plug this into your computer with it powered on or wirelessly transfer it to your phone. Now I do like that the R1 has the ability to transfer low bitrate video automatically as a preview to the app while it's flying, but it's a little inconvenient to have this plugged onto your laptop or onto your computer and have it powered on when its battery is being drained. Speaking of battery, flight time is rated at 16 minutes and you do get 2 batteries, but in our tests, flight time was really more like 12 to 14 minutes of usable flight before we had to take this down and recharge the battery. But we never found ourselves in an opportunity to film a 12 or 15 minute long continuous sequence. This R1 would either get hung up by an obstacle or lose visual tracking. So really your shots are going to be more in that 4 to 5 minute range, and even then that feels pretty long when you're flying and doing some type of activity. There is an app control for manual flight, and I like that they have this one-handed flight control system where you can adjust the height and its distance from you using sliders, but it was far from the responsiveness that I was used to with a physical controller like I would find on the Mavic or the Phantom 4. So with the Skydio R1, you can get some pretty stunning footage when you're in motion that's unlike anything I've been able to get with a manually controlled quadcopter. And the Skydio does make getting that footage really easy, though you don't have a lot of control over exactly the shot you're getting. You're almost at the behest of the algorithm here for where the quadcopter is going to be relative to the action. You can't say, I want to get the Skydio in this position, at this moment, at this angle, when I'm going to do this jump, when I'm snowboarding, for example. You kind of have to cross your fingers and hope the quadcopter is going to be in that angle or fly in that tripod mode, which is less dynamic. But the fact that we couldn't get the R1 to crash and we could do all these amazing shots so easily does almost feel magical. It's a technology that I really didn't expect us to have in 2018. It's not perfect, and at $2,500, it's not cheap either. Skydio says it's more like the Tesla Model S of drones. It's a first generation, high-end proof of concept that's going to pave the way for more accessible and more robust options down the line. But if you want to use that analogy, you know, the Model S came out 5 years ago, and even if you bought a Model S back then, you still have a top-of-the-line car today, even with the Model X and the Model 3 in the market. My fear is that drone technology and camera technology are going to improve in ways that are going to make the R1 feel more obsolete just 2 years down the line when there are going to be more options. If you're an early adopter and you have the money to spend, I think you're going to be thrilled with what this drone can do today. But honestly, I'm way more excited about the technology in the drone and the type of drones that are going to use this computer vision technology tomorrow.